JP Morgan's CEO Jamie Dimon calls this economy a roller coaster, and he may very well be right as we watch the US navigate these dramatic times with the global economy. But these can also be the kinds of roller coasters that an investor only dreams of, high risk and high reward. In this iteration of the Swift Hour, we talk with David Rubenstein, the famed billionaire philanthropist and co-founder of private equity behemoth, the Carlyle Group. Mr. Rubenstein wanted to understand what it was that made successful investors tick, what they all have in common, and how we define the true investors that are masters on the craft. So we are here to talk about David's new book, How to Invest, Masters on the Craft, but we're also going to get in a few other topic areas of discussion, and this feels great because I'm turning the tables on you a little bit. Normally you're the one asking all the questions.
So did you prepare for this? Let me ask you a couple questions.
Oh boy. Wait, so let's talk about this. As someone who I have no investment experience.
Okay.
What makes a good investor?
Well, a lot of different qualities, but a good investor, as opposed to a great investor, a good investor is probably somebody that's reasonably intelligent. You don't have to be a genius. You prepare, you specialize in one area, you can overcome your mistakes and not live with them, and then you want to do it for the right reasons.
So, but you talk a lot about in this book, there's a real diversity of background and experiences, so there's no one formula that makes a good investor.
Well, I've interviewed in this book the best investors in the United States in their categories, or among the best, and they have some certain things in common. One, they tend to come from blue-collar families or lower middle-class families. They tend to have been pretty good students. They tend to be pretty good in math. They tend to be willing to admit mistakes and get out of the mistakes. Sometimes they make a mistake, they admit it relatively quickly. They tend to be people who are willing to go against conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is X, and the great investors go to Y. And they also tend to be humble because when you're an investor, you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and that gives them some humility. And they tend to be very philanthropic because most of them have made a fair amount of money, and they're doing this now after they've made a lot of money because they enjoy the game. It's for them a sport almost, not just making money.
So when one of the big themes of this summit over the next 3 days is the future of ESG reporting. It's all of a sudden seems to have become almost a political issue, a very divisive issue. If it's one person's ESG report, it's Elon Musk's impact report, it's someone else's citizenship report. Where does ESG reporting fit into your investment calculus?
Well, Carlyle has a very large ESG and a very, I'd say, industry-leading ESG group. You know you're getting old when your ESG group is being led by somebody who went to college with your daughter. So the head of Carlyle's ESG group was in college with my daughter, and she's very good, Meg Starr. We think it's very important. There's somebody in the book, David Blood, who started a firm with Al Gore, known as Blood and Gore, but it's actually a firm that is designed to focus on ESG investing, and they've beaten the market averages for the last 20-some years. So you can focus on ESG and do well, but there are some investors, most investors are not as focused on it as, let's say, David Blood is.
So we were talking earlier today to Ian Bremmer, and he talked about this significant difference between where he would rank our democratic institutions versus how the U.S. economy is doing. Are the two, to some extent, there is such a difference. Where do you see this playing out from an economy perspective?
Well, the economy today is not in recession, and nobody knows whether we'll go into recession. Clearly, the Fed is expected this week to announce a hike of maybe 75 basis points on the federal discount rate. The market's already assumed that's the case. If they were to do more than 75, I think it would really push the stock market further down. You can move out of a recession over a period of time, and you can move out of inflationary periods over a period of time. It takes a year or two or three to get out of those periods, those problems. Democratic institutions move much more slowly. So if your democracy has a serious problem, it's not going to be turned around overnight. It's just much slower because it's a much more complicated and cumbersome process.
But so then how would you read the current situation in the United States from a U.S. economic perspective versus what's happening in our politics and our institutions?
Well, the economy will self-correct much more quickly. So right now, while we're not in a recession, we're in let's say a lower growth mode. We have high inflation, high interest rates. That will self-correct in a year or two or so. If we go into recession, it will correct after a while. Recession is only maybe 2 quarters of negative growth. Democratic institutions move so much more slowly that I think it's unlikely you can solve the problem we have in our democracy. Our democracy isn't working so wonderfully because the Democrats and Republicans are sparring with each other all the time. You don't have a situation where people think that bipartisanship is very good. I host a dinner once a month for members of Congress where I interview a great American historian, and members of Congress love it because they can sit with somebody from the opposite party in the opposite house and not be criticized. Normally, they're not allowed to do that.
Got it. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about, you talk a little bit about philanthropy in this book. You talk about how some of the biggest investors, it's a game to them. It's a ranking to them, right? But at the end of the day, they give it all away. A lot of them do. Do you see that as a consistent trend with some of the most successful investors?
Well, philanthropy generally is thought to be a good thing for most people to do, and society generally welcomes it, though there has been pushback in recent years from some people saying, well, why should the philanthropists decide what to do with their money? Why don't they pay more taxes and let the government decide? But as a general rule of thumb, when you're giving away your own money, and I like to remind people that philanthropy is derived from an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. And you can love humanity by giving your time. That's the most valuable thing you have. You can't make more time. Nobody can make more time. You can make more money if you're really disposed to do so. So I try to get people to focus on giving their time as well as their energy and ideas as well as money. As a general rule of thumb, I think maybe there's a selfishness in it because when you give away money and your time and you help other people, you feel happier about yourself. And happy people live longer. So my theory is if you want to live longer, give away your time and your money and you'll be happier about yourself. Grumpy people don't live as long. You never notice that?
True. Now your focus, though, is philanthropy connected oftentimes to American history, right?
Not so much. In other words, most of my money goes to educational institutions, scholarships, and medical research. But it's not as well known because people are doing much more than I'm doing there, and it's not so unique. So if I put up $10 million to fix the Washington Monument, people say, well, it's a great thing, and it's not terrible, but it's not the same as Bill Gates giving $1 billion away for malaria. That's more impactful, but it doesn't get as much attention because Bill Gates is expected to do that, and people are surprised when a private citizen will fix the Lincoln Memorial, fix the Jefferson Memorial, or other things like that I've done. It gets a disproportionate amount of attention.
Now, some of that attention, though, talks a little bit about what people perceive as you trying to change how things are presented at sites like Monticello or other historical sites, Mount Vernon.
Well, that's sometimes the press says something that's not quite accurate. I don't know if you've observed this, but so I went to Monticello and I didn't think it was in great shape about 10 years ago. So I asked them how much money it would take to fix it. They told me, so I gave them that money. I did the same with Montpelier, which is James Madison's home. And that was 10 years ago. I don't really do the tours at Monticello or Montpelier, so I'm not really conversant with what they're saying on the tours. But there was some criticism from some people saying that they were emphasizing now that Madison and Jefferson were slave owners, which they were. That was not really mentioned 50 years ago in those tours, or 40 years ago. It's mentioned now, but it's not obsessive about it. And if you want a tour that talks in Monticello about the slave-owning qualities of Jefferson, you can get that. If you want to avoid that, they have a different type of tour as well. But I think it's important to point out that people are not perfect, and Jefferson and Madison were, as George Washington was, and many of our first presidents, they were slave owners. And they knew what the slavery had lots of moral issues to it, but they weren't able to escape that issue. So I think it's important to point out the good and the bad, because the theory of history is if you learn the mistakes of the past, you will correct them and do better as civilization moves forward.
So shifting a little bit on that one, talk about because you really, more than anything, you also are a historian. You study U.S. history very closely.
I've written some books, but historians are people that are doing original research. I wouldn't say I'm a historian. I've written about the history things.
But put this time into context for us, in historical context. Because I think there's a lot of people that feel very pessimistic. There's a lot of,
Look, during the Civil War, we lost 700,000 American citizens, roughly 3% of the population. So today our population is 330 million people. It's like losing 9 or 10 million people in our country. So we're not at the Civil War where people are killing each other in that kind of bloody combat. So we've had worse times. What we have now is a situation where the Democrats and Republicans, by and large, are not able to come together on most issues. And that's in part because to raise money, members of Congress love to raise money. Why? Because the more money you have, it scares off opponents. And the more money you have, you can give it to other members of Congress, maybe to help get leadership positions. And the more money you have, the more likely you are to win. Plus, you can keep the money after you leave office, not for personal purposes, but for political purposes. So people love to raise money, and they're obsessed about doing it. And members of Congress spend about 40% of their time raising money, members of the House. And it's a bad situation in the House because members have to spend all this time raising money. They don't have much money themselves. 75 members of Congress live in their House offices because they can't afford a separate apartment. We haven't given them a salary increase in 20 years, or they haven't taken a salary increase. They could have one if they wanted one, but they don't want to do it. So right now, you've got members of Congress raising money. They spend a lot of time doing it. You don't raise money from people that say, oh, I want somebody right down the middle. I want a bipartisan member of Congress. That doesn't raise money. What raises money is somebody on the far left or the far right, and that's where you appeal to people. So when you have people on the far left and the far right raising money from those people, they tend to have influence, and that's why bipartisanship is kind of a bygone concept in Washington, with rare exceptions.
So you've made this shift into media. You've got the show, right, peer-to-peer. You're writing a number of books. But why that shift to media? What made you want to turn the table and all of a sudden be the interviewer?
Well, I thought it was intellectually interesting. You like interviewing, right? You like it. I assume you like it. So why do you like it?
I love to learn. Okay. I like to listen.
Okay. So I enjoy it because it keeps your brain sharp. When you reach a certain age, you want to make sure your brain is still working and active. And so it's an intellectual sparring. I get to read up about a lot of interesting people. And the trick is, and the secret is that if you're interviewing people, you can interview almost anybody and get to meet almost anybody. If you don't interview people, you're going to be in your narrow lane. You know, you're a business person, you're a Hollywood person, you're a reporter. You're going to meet a very narrow slice of society. By interviewing different people, I can get to know people from different backgrounds and hopefully learn more. But it's fun and I enjoy it. And I'm not a professional, but I enjoy it.
What are some of the best interviews that you've done? What have you enjoyed most?
Well, other people say were the best. The ones I've enjoyed was it's fairly good when you have a live audience, because when you have a live audience, you can play to the audience, and the audience, if you use humor, and the audience picks it up, it makes it more interesting, and the guests will probably be more humorous. So when I had Jeff Bezos in Washington, we had about 3,000 people in the audience, and so he has a pretty good sense of humor, and he could play along with some of the jokes I was trying to ask him about, and he was good. Sometimes when I had President Bush and President Clinton together, you have two former presidents at the same time. They had a pretty good sense of humor about what we were talking about. So humor usually works, and so it works better with a live audience. Sometimes if you ask people that don't have a good sense of humor, there's no live audience there, they won't get the joke. So I've asked a famous person, if you had a college degree, you think you'd have been more successful, and he didn't get the joke, so he just gave a serious answer because the audience wasn't there. When the audience is there, they laugh, then that person realizes it's a joke. I won't mention the name.
Let's go back to the book a little bit on the from an economic perspective, on an investment perspective. This growing, or what feels like this growing economic divide in the country between the upper class and lower class, a shrinking middle class. There is this disconnect, and it's playing out in our politics. We talked about that for a minute. How do investors, some of the most successful investors that you interviewed, how do they see the future of the country and the future of how people are thinking on these issues?
They're great investors because they know how to do that. If they were great politicians, they'd be in Iowa and New Hampshire and trying to get votes. They're not. That's not their obsession. Obviously, as well-intentioned and smart people, they recognize the problem our country has. We have greater wealth disparity than we've ever had before. I wouldn't say it's their obsession. Is there one solution to this problem? Obviously, if we had a solution, we would all engage in what it is. One solution that doesn't get enough discussion, in my view, is reading. Right now, in this country, roughly 30-some% of adults are functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 4th grade level, 30-some%. And if you can't read past the 4th grade level, your chance of succeeding is very limited. So right now, 80% of the people in our juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate, and 2/3 of the people in our federal prisons are functionally illiterate. So if we could get people to actually read and stay in high school, so usually if they stay in high school, they have a better chance of learning how to read, that would solve a lot of problems. But you're not going to solve all of society's problems by taxing the wealthy, in my view. You can take all the money of the people in the Forbes 400 and take it all away, confiscate it. It's not going to solve the problems of the society. You have people that just still can't read. That's not going to solve that problem.
Let's shift a little bit less away from U.S. economy, specifically globally. U.S.-China.
U.S.-China relationship is as bad as it's been since we've really formalized a relationship with China, which was actually done in the Carter administration in which I served, though obviously Richard Nixon began the effort. Right now, there is no political penalty in the United States for saying something bad about China. There's no political reward for saying, hey, we ought to be nicer to China. Let's see if we can have a nice summit with the president of China. You don't get any political benefits. The Democrats and Republicans are both feeling there's benefits from being tough on China. In some cases, even promoting Taiwan, which obviously is a red flag to the Chinese government. So I don't think it's going to change for a while. I just don't see the current administration being willing to soften its position, and certainly the Republicans are not going to soften their position and be seen as softer than Biden is. So I don't see any great progress there in the near future.
How does it change for a company like Carlyle and business? What's the dynamic that's changed?
Well, it's clearly tougher for all businesses to invest there if you're an American investor or not a Chinese investor, because there are more constraints on the Chinese companies than there were before. There are more regulatory constraints. We've seen what's been done already, and some of them slowing down the IPO process and putting more government constraints on it. I think we'll see our way through this, and I think the Chinese government is going to try to be more liberalizing in the future, but there's no doubt that it's made it more challenging to invest and exit from Chinese investments than it was 10 years ago.
Russia, Ukraine.
Well, there, I think most people were surprised that the Ukrainians have done as well as they have done, because they didn't have the military equipment initially, and people thought the Russians would overwhelm them. It is interesting that when the U.S. government did something it had never done before, which is, in fact, give away our intelligence to our allies and show them our raw intelligence and then make it public, we still could not convince our allies that the invasion was going to occur. And that's because they said, well, you said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and there weren't, so I don't think they believed our intelligence. Later, when the invasion occurred, I think the Allies moved reasonably quickly to kind of shore up the Ukrainian defenses. Now the question is whether Ukraine can actually move forward with the progress that's already made. But I don't see any agreement in the near term for this. This is the reason. The Russians cannot agree to anything, in my view, in a peace agreement that says that the U.S. can keep the foreign reserves that we've frozen, the U.S. can keep the oligarchs' assets, or that there won't be war crime trials. But we, in turn, cannot agree to anything which doesn't allow war crime trials, or which gives any of the oligarchs' assets back, or gives all the foreign reserves back. So I don't think you're going to get an agreement. It's going to be, in my view, more like an armistice or a thing that we have in Korea, where there's no real peace agreement in Korea. We've been there for 70 years with this armistice. So, and a kind of a, you keep the land you have, we'll keep the land we have, and we'll kind of keep it at the 53rd parallel. So I suspect you'll probably have at some point the Russians and Ukrainians will probably agree, though nobody would say this today publicly from the governments, they'll probably stay where they are at some point, and I suspect that'll be the only resolution. There's not going to be a peace agreement anytime soon.
Optimistic about the future of Europe? Pessimistic from a business standpoint?
Well, Europe is in a much more difficult situation than the United States because they have energy needs that we don't quite have. We are more energy independent, not completely so, but more energy independent than Europe. So they have to pay for high cost energy for as long as this war is going on. And so I think they have, and they have more difficult financial problems in some of the countries. So they are more likely to go into a recession than we are. I don't know if they will, but they're more likely to do so. They're raising interest rates as well. They have inflation as well, that's very high, and they've got energy problems we don't quite have. And I think in England, Brexit, I think, has not been helpful to the British economy, though if there was a vote today, I suspect the vote would be roughly the same as it was before. There's not a big perception of changing that, but I think the British economy has not been helped by it. So all of those things added together, I think Europe is in a less good economic position than the U.S.
Second to last question, but when you look at South America, when you look at Africa, when you look at emerging markets, what is your advice to governments to make it more appealing to invest?
Well, emerging markets, historically, the theory was that there's less competition, prices are lower, political risks are greater, but if you stay with it and you're willing to take some longer term holding periods of time, you can get higher rates of return. That has not actually proven to be the case over the last 10 years. The rates of return in emerging markets, by and large, on average, have not exceeded those in developed markets. So the bloom is off the rose on a lot of emerging market investments, but then what's the definition of an emerging market? Is China an emerging market? the second biggest economy in the world. Is India an emerging market? Some people would say yes, but some people would say no. So it depends on your definition of an emerging market. But on the whole, you need to be willing to be investing in emerging markets for a long-term hold and really have a willingness to put up with some political problems. And but I do think the United States has political problems too. In other words, very often when you invest in emerging markets, people say you have to worry about political risk. Well, you have political risk when you invest in the United States too.
Last question. Favorite investor?
Well,
who did you
I
connect
have
to the most?
3 children, and it's like saying which of my children would be my favorite, so I'm not going to say that, but I would say all of the people I interview are great investors, and I would say they have made staggering sums of money. But the most important point I wanted to make about the investors is that not that they're not brilliant people and they haven't done well, but what they're doing is they are helping our country by allocating capital in ways that make sense. So the venture capital investors, for example, who invested in Moderna, they took a big risk, and that risk paid off for our society, because without Moderna's vaccines, we wouldn't probably all be here right now. So I would say that when people are investing capital and they're doing it wisely, you're helping a country and you're really doing something good. So I don't think investors should be seen as only greedy people trying to pile up money. They're doing things that help our country by creating jobs and making companies better, and to some extent, that's what I want people to get out of the book.
David, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.